Hello, everyone. We are back. I'm Carly Riley. I have been covering the Sam Bankman-Fried trial, going to court every day since this case began to give everyone the breakdown and the scoops on what is happening in this crazy case. But we did not have court today. And so instead, I thought I would do something a little different, which is I went back and listened to some of Sam's old statements that he made right after the collapse of FTX to various journalists. And I wanted to break down one of those statements in particular in light of what we now know because we've seen the trial. So I picked one in particular that had stuck out in my mind because when I first heard Sam say this, I was somewhat compelled by it. This is from a conversation he had with Tiffany Fong. This conversation was posted on November 29th. So it was like a couple weeks after FTX declared bankruptcy. And Sam was doing this whole thing where he was sort of acting like all of this was just like maybe one big oopsie whoopsie. Like I just kind of got confused by stuff and it all got really over my head and, shoot, darn, dang it, right? Like that's his vibe. And I have not yet read Michael Lewis's book, Going Infinite, because it came out the day trial started. So I've been swamped with court. But my sense is that it's this same kind of attitude that Michael was compelled by and that people have been somewhat taken in by. So I want to hear this particular quote from Sam, and then I want to break it down in light of what we've learned in the last 2 weeks of trial. I'm going to play this clip, but be warned, he's a bit hard to understand, so I will also repeat it after so you have a better sense of it, especially for folks who are listening on audio only, who listen to the podcast version of this, where it may be really hard to decipher what he's saying without any sort of captions.
I was wrong. I was incorrect on Alameda's balances on FTX by a fairly large number, an embarrassingly large one. And it was because of a very poorly labeled accounting thing, which was a historical artifact of a time before when, from before FTX had bank accounts. And the result of that was basically there was a time way back yonder when people would wire money to Alameda and then ask to be credited on FTX. That just basically never got screwed up. And that was a pretty big miss and meant that Alameda was substantially more levered than I thought it was.
Okay, so here's what Sam said, and I'll link to this below if you also want to go check out the original recording yourself that Tiffany posted. He said, I was incorrect on Alameda's balances on FTX by a fairly large number, an embarrassingly large number. And it was because of a very poorly labeled accounting thing, which was a historical artifact of a time before when, from before FTX had bank accounts. And the result of that was basically there was a time way back yonder when people would wire money to Alameda and then have to be credited on FTX. And that just basically never got trued up. And that was a pretty big miss and meant that Alameda was substantially more leveraged than I thought it was. Let's break down what in hindsight is wrong with this statement. And again, when I first heard this, I was like, okay. I wanted to have an open mind. Maybe he's telling the truth here and he really did just get confused by a bunch of things. But let's break it down. Okay. First thing, he says, I was incorrect on Alameda's balances by a fairly large number. Now, the problem with this is we have now heard testimony in court by multiple different people. I would say 4 different people, Nishad, Gary, Caroline, and Adam, who all have testimony to indicate that Sam had every reason to know exactly what the balance of Alameda on FTX was at several key moments. First being in June, we have Gary, Nishad, really all 4 of them in some way testifying to the fact that Sam knew what Alameda's debt to FTX and specifically to FTX customers was in June because they did a whole accounting effort in that month, the 4 main executives, Sam, Gary, Nishad, and Caroline. And then additionally, Sam indicated to Adam Yedidia, who was a lead software developer at Alameda and one of his very oldest friends, Adam testified that he and Sam hung out on a paddle tennis court in the Bahamas, in which Sam made it clear, he's like, we were bulletproof last year, we're not bulletproof this year, specifically in regards to the debt that Alameda owed FTX. And again, they had calculated that exact number, which was something on the order of $11 billion in June, and Sam was alerted to this fact by multiple people and even referenced it in ways like I just mentioned to people like Adam Yedidia. So that's one, that's June. Now, fast forward to September of 2022, which is the next important moment here. Sam circulates a document suggesting that maybe Alameda should be shut down, which prompts an investigation, which reveals that Alameda now owes FTX $14 billion. So that number has ballooned from 11 billion to 14 billion. And they conclude they can't shut Alameda down because they owe FTX, and specifically FTX customers, way too much money. And Sam, again, is aware of this because he is privy to some degree to these conversations and is certainly informed about all of these conversations. And this is to say nothing of the many spreadsheets and or balance sheets that we saw in court that Caroline shared with Sam that clearly indicated they were borrowing many, 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 many billions of dollars from FTX and specifically from FTX customers. Now, the one thing I will say in Sam's defense, because I want to be open-minded about this, is that it is one thing to hear this story in the context of testimony at a trial, where the focal points of every story is when and how Sam knew about how much money was owed to FTX by Alameda. Taking this, going back in time and actually thinking about being Sam over the course of 2022, he obviously had a lot on his plate. He had a lot on his mind. He was trying to get regulatory approval for different licenses. He was trying to fundraise. He was like, at 30,000 things he was doing as the CEO of FTX and the owner of Alameda. And so clearly these meetings, these moments didn't loom as large for him in real time as they do now, hearing the story in hindsight told essentially through the lens of a prosecution. And I would say the biggest piece of evidence for that is the very fact that he thought Alameda maybe could be shut down as of September 2022, despite 3 months earlier having been told that Alameda owed FTX $11 billion. Like, in some ways that does validate his case that he just somehow wasn't keeping track of the numbers here, that he even thought that that was a possibility in September of 2022. But that just doesn't exonerate you. First of all, you should have been much more concerned about this than you were. So it shows a certain kind of lack of judgment that is itself criminally negligent at best. And second of all, I think he really just wasn't as concerned about this as he should be because his risk appetite is borderline deranged. And again, that isn't actually something that exonerates you just because you were willing to take crazy risks with your customers' money. Okay. Finally, in November, when everything was imploding, it was Sam who helped instruct Gary to do certain things that Gary didn't even know how to do, that revealed the full extent of the debt that Alameda owed to FTX, indicating that Sam was actually one of the few people who did have a full grasp on exactly the situation and where all the accounting records were held, demonstrating just what that debt was. So to say, like, he didn't know, I didn't know how large the balances were, I'm going to call BS on that. But that's nothing to me almost, compared to the just absolute manipulation tactic I feel went on with part 2 of this statement by Sam, which is he says he was wrong about these balances because of, quote, a poorly labeled accounting thing, which he describes as an artifact of this time before when FTX didn't have its own bank accounts. And so money was sent directly to Alameda, and that number got screwed up. That number of like what was being held in the Alameda balance sheet got screwed up. Okay. So when I heard this the first time, I was like, well, that does sound like maybe it was just a bunch of kids getting in over their head. They weren't accounting for things well. They had multiple different accounts. Not that I think that that's really a great excuse. I mean, Sam's older than I am, right? Like, I want to hold him to a higher standard than just like, he's just a kid. But I was like, maybe there's some credence here. Maybe that is what happened. Except we now know all about this accounting system and the poorly labeled accounts. And here's what happened. In 2021, and in 2020, 2021, in the early days of FTX, if folks wanted to wire money to FTX, it would get wired to this Alameda-controlled bank account because FTX didn't have its own bank accounts. And then there was this settlement team within FTX who had to do a couple of things. One, they would track that the money was deposited to this bank account. They would make a note of that somewhere. They would then have to make sure that the right amount of money was reflected on a user's FTX account. And then they also had an internal ledger that was used by both Alameda and FTX to track internally how much customer money had been deposited in the Alameda bank account. And that was colloquially called the fiat at account. It was just an accounting account within the FTX system showing how much money had been sent. So you had people in the settlement team who would reconcile all of these things. And that was incredibly time consuming. And as more and more people began depositing money into FTX, it became really hard to keep up with all of this reconciliation that had to be done. So Sam asked, I think Gary, who then farmed it off to Adam Yedidia or whatever happened, Adam Yedidia was the one who worked on this, to basically automate a system by which all of these numbers would be tracked and populated automatically without having to have all this manual interference by the settlement team, which Adam did. But there was a problem with the code that he wrote. The way things were supposed to work is that if a customer deposited money into this bank account controlled by Alameda, the fiat at account, the internal accounting system account that was held within FTX, that number would get more negative, because what that account was tracking was the liability, was the money that Alameda owed to FTX. And it was tracked as a liability. So it's saying Alameda owes FTX X number of dollars, So it's reflected as like negative 8 billion because that's what they owe. And every time somebody else deposited money into that account, that debt that they owed got larger, meaning the number got more negative. Okay, in the reverse then, if somebody withdrew their money from their FTX account and that money was then paid back and came out of the Alameda bank account, that number would get less negative because they were paying back their debt and they owed less money. But with this bug that was introduced in the code that Adam wrote, when certain types of withdrawals were initiated, that it didn't track in this coding system, which means the number in the fiat ad account didn't get less negative as people withdrew their money in certain types of withdrawal scenarios. And so what actually happened was the fiat ad account showed that Alameda was more in debt to FTX and FTX customers than they actually were. So this bug gets discovered late in 2021, somewhere around December of 2021. Gary points it out to Adam, but says don't worry about it. This bug works in the right direction in the sense that, again, in a properly run company that was actually doing things by the book, Alameda would actually be holding on to more money than they needed to because they would think that they owed more money than they actually did to FTX customers. So this is kind of strange to me, but they don't fix this bug immediately in late 2021, I guess because they're like, it works in the right direction and we've got other priorities, so we're just not going to worry about this. Now, fast forward to June of 2022, all these accounting meetings are taking place, and Caroline Ellison is quite nervous because she's like, oh my God, we owe what looks like $19 billion to FTX and FTX customers, at which point Gary's like, no, there's a bug. It is overstating the liability. And it is now at that point in June of 2022 that the bug gets fixed to reflect the right amounts of everything, and it turns out... Don't worry, Alameda only owes $11 billion to FTX and FTX customers. Just a mere 11 bill. It's no big deal. Now, Sam was privy to all of these conversations. In fact, he apparently made some comment like, oh my gosh, it's amazing how much havoc one little bug can wreak. He makes some comment like that, and one of them testified to. So turning now back to this statement by Sam.
There was a time way back yonder when people would wire money to Alameda and then ask to be credited on FTX. That just basically never got screwed up. And that was like a pretty big miss and meant that Alameda was like substantially more levered than I thought it was.
And he's referred to this in a couple other moments where he's like, that number got screwed up because of this weird thing where people were depositing money to Alameda. That number of how much was owed got screwed up. And the implication being like, and that totally screwed me up, is just BS, because the number actually would have been favorable to you. If you weren't doing shisty shit, this wouldn't have been a problem. You would have had way more money on reserve than you could have possibly needed to pay back customers. So nothing about that makes actual sense once you understand what actually happened. But goddamn, does it sound like a good talking point? Oh my God, there was $8 billion that got messed up in an internal counting system. I thought there was extra money somewhere. That sounds so great if you're trying to defend yourself in like an abstract, vague way before anybody knows any of the details. And again, I even fell for it a bit myself when I listened to this, when I listened to him say this before I'd watched this trial, where I was like, oh God, well, if money is missing because something is poorly labeled and there was this other bank account and you thought there was more money in there than there actually was. He's kind of alluded to that in times before. Like, I just thought there was more money in this other account, and it turns out this $8 billion blah, 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 blah. Final thing I want to talk about. The context in which Sam made this statement at all. Because this is the final piece of this puzzle. The question that led Sam to this answer was that Tiffany was asking him about a Reuters article in which Reuters had claimed that there was this, quote, backdoor that Sam was able to use to funnel money from FTX to Alameda. And when Tiffany poses this to him, Sam acts all confused and he's like, what? Like a backdoor that I put in to be able to funnel money? Like, I don't even know how to code. I'm so useless and dumb, blah, blah, blah. Like, that's the vibe he's giving. And that's when he then launches into this answer being like, the only thing I can think that they're thinking of is that in the early days when FTX didn't have its own bank accounts, customers would wire money directly to Alameda, and like, maybe that's what they mean by this backdoor. Okay. Well, what we now know is that Alameda had a $65 billion line of credit with FTX that was set by Sam, effectively. I mean, it was an unlimited line of credit. The point of the $65 billion number was just to pick a number big enough that Alameda would stop bumping up against their credit limit, which Sam had instructed Gary to do because he was annoyed that Alameda kept bumping up against their credit limit. And then part 2 of this is that Sam had instructed Nishad to build this allow negative feature within the code base, which meant that Alameda and Alameda only, their accounts were able to hold negative balances on the FTX exchange. No other accounts could do this. Alameda could have infinity negative balances on the FTX exchange. And that is how Alameda was able to take all of this money from FTX. Call it whatever you want. It looks a lot like a backdoor for Alameda to take money from FTX. And Sam instructed all of this stuff to happen. So when Sam is asked about this backdoor and he's like scratching his head being like, the closest thing I can think of is this relic from a past time when customers would wire money to an Alameda bank account. Like, really, bro? That's what you thought of? You didn't think about the allow negative and the $65 billion line of credit, which was the way that Alameda was taking all of his FTX customer money? I just don't buy it. And so I really think he was just lying. And I know y'all are like, yeah, no shit, Carly. Like, Sam lies. Like, we all now realize this. He lost $8 billion of customer money, whether it was him or just the 2 companies that he owned and one of which he even explicitly ran. Like, obviously he's a liar, but it is so interesting because when you hear him speak, it just doesn't feel like he's lying. Anyway, this is, I understand how Michael Lewis could get taken in by all of this, but I think when you really stack up what he has said against what we really know to be the truth at this point, there's just too much of a disconnect between the statements. In any case, folks, thank you so much for watching, checking this out. I'll be back tomorrow. Court starts up again on Thursday, so we'll be back with the specific trial updates then. Thank you so much for liking, commenting, subscribing. Please do continue it. And if you have anything in particular that you would like me to cover in future videos or things you're confused about, please do leave a comment below. I will check them out, and I'll definitely use them to inform what I talk about in future videos. Thanks so much.